The sound of hammers and drills echoed throughout a construction site on the outskirts of Dallas, Texas. Amidst the dust and frantic shouts, a man with a hard hat stained with sweat stopped. He held a blueprint in his hand and frowned. "Wait!" he shouted, his voice hoarse from the dust. The group of masons stopped and looked at him in surprise. The construction manager, a large white man with a clipboard, frowned in annoyance. "What's this, Joe? Don't waste my time. You're just a mason. Get to work. Don't try to be smart." But Joe didn't respond. He walked quickly to the unfinished wall, used white chalk to make a few sharp strokes on the cement, then pulled out the paper and sketched out the details with his bare hands. The lines were quick, decisive, and incredibly precise. "This, if we continue to build as shown, the house will tilt 15 degrees. When we install the window frames, the entire roof will collapse under the load." Joe spoke slowly, looking straight at the manager. A moment of silence. Everyone was bewildered. A young worker blurted out a sneer. "He thinks he's an architect? A bricklayer wants to lecture on theory?" Joe remained calm, placing the sketch on the ground. His strokes were clear, no different from the technical drawings he had learned in school. The heat was brutal that morning, the kind of Texas summer heat that burned the back of your neck even through a hard hat. The construction site smelled of cement, iron dust, and sweat, a cocktail of labor that hung heavy in the air. Machines rattled, drills screamed, and the rhythmic pounding of hammers created a relentless symphony. Men shouted to one another over the noise, their voices carrying both urgency and fatigue. Joe wiped his forehead with the back of his sleeve, leaving a streak of gray cement dust across his skin. His shirt clung to his back, drenched in sweat, but he hardly noticed. His eyes weren't on the bricks stacked in front of him. They were fixed on the set of blueprints crumpled in his rough hands. Something wasn't right. At first, he thought it was fatigue making his eyes play tricks. He squinted, tracing the lines on the blueprint with his calloused finger. His brow furrowed deeper the more he looked. No, this wasn't a mistake in his head. It was real, and it was big. "Stop!" Joe's voice, hoarse from dust, cut sharply across the site. The noise faltered. A hammer missed its mark and clanged against metal. Workers turned, staring at him with confusion, some with irritation. Interruptions weren't welcome here. Time was money, and every pause cost the contractor. The site manager, Carl Thompson, a stout man with a thick mustache and a permanent scowl, marched forward with a clipboard tucked under his arm. His boots crunched hard against gravel as he bore down on Joe. "What the hell is it this time?" Carl barked. "You see a ghost, Joe?" Joe didn't flinch. He held the blueprint higher. "This isn't lining up. If we keep building like this, the whole section will be off by 15 degrees. The load-bearing walls won't support the roof." For a moment there was silence, then laughter rippled through the younger workers. One of them, a wiry kid named Danny, smirked and called out, "What do you know about blueprints, old man? Just stack your bricks." Carl smirked too, satisfied. "Exactly. You're here to lay mortar, not to read plans. Leave the thinking to people who get paid for it." Joe's jaw tightened, but he didn't argue. Instead, he bent down, picked up a stub of white chalk from the ground, and strode over to the half-laid foundation. He knelt and began to draw directly on the concrete slab. His hand moved fast, measured, precise, practiced. Within seconds, the rough chalk lines took shape. A corrected angle, a recalculated frame, a sketch of what the wall should look like. The laughter faded. The workers leaned closer. The mocking turned into murmurs. Joe stood, brushing chalk dust from his palm. "You keep building like this," he said, pointing to the official blueprint in Carl's hands, "and you'll be tearing it all down when the roof buckles. And when that happens, it won't just cost money. It could kill someone." Carl's face darkened. "You think you're smarter than the architects who designed this?" You think you know better than the inspectors who signed off? I don't think, Joe replied evenly. I know. The words landed like a hammer. Bold. Too bold for a man in Joe's position. He was the dumb bricklayer, the one who kept his head down and worked. He had never spoken like this before. The sight buzzed with unease, and then another voice, calm but commanding, sliced through the tension. Let me see that. Everyone turned. Richard Hall, the project's lead contractor and a seasoned architect with graying temples and sharp eyes, had been standing at the edge of the commotion. Unlike Carl, Richard wasn't sweating anger. He radiated composure, authority. He walked forward, took the chalk-sketched correction from the ground, and studied it against the blueprint. A long silence followed. The only sounds were the distant hum of machinery and the restless shifting of boots. Joe's heart pounded, though his face remained steady. He wasn't used to this kind of attention. He wasn't supposed to be the man in the center. Finally, Richard looked up. His expression was unreadable, but his tone was resolute. This man, Richard said slowly, is correct. A collective gasp swept through the workers. Carl's mouth opened, then closed again. Danny, the young laborer who had mocked Joe, dropped his gaze to the ground. No one dared to laugh now. Richard crouched, gesturing to Joe's chalk lines. See here? If they'd kept to the blueprint, this wall would lean into the support beam at the wrong angle. By the time we installed the roof, the entire frame would have been compromised. It would have been a disaster. The weight of the words settled heavily. Disaster. No one took that lightly. Carl stammered. But the blueprint passed review, and reviews miss things. Richard cut him off. His gaze shifted back to Joe. Tell me, where did you learn to draft like this? The question struck deeper than any insult ever had. Joe felt the old ache stir inside him, the ache of a dream buried long ago. His mouth opened, but he hesitated. For years he'd hidden that part of his life, buried it under cement and sweat. To speak of it now felt like tearing open a scar. Still, something about Richard's eyes, sharp yet curious, made him answer. I studied architecture once, Joe said quietly, but I never finished. The workers stared. The idea that the man they'd dismissed as a grunt with calloused hands had once sat in a classroom, learning the very art of design, unsettled them. Richard's lips curved slightly, not into a smile but into recognition. He nodded, thoughtful. I see. The silence that followed was thick, electric. Everyone could feel that something had shifted, though none of them could name it. Joe, chalk still smudged on his hand, suddenly felt the weight of eyes on him, not just as a laborer, but as someone different, someone who didn't quite belong in only one world. And for the first time in years, the thought frightened and exhilarated him all at once. Joe sat on the edge of his narrow bed, the hum of the old ceiling fan filling the silence of his apartment. His boots were still on, his shirt stiff with dried sweat and dust, but he hadn't moved since pulling open that forgotten drawer. On his lap rested a sketchbook, its cover frayed, its pages curled with age. He ran his fingers across it, brushing away the faint layer of dust. He hadn't opened it in years. For a moment, he hesitated, almost afraid of what he would feel. But then he flipped it open. There they were, lines, curves, and angles that once defined his life. Pages filled with buildings that never existed outside his imagination. A two-story library with sunlight filtering through vaulted windows. A modest suburban house with a porch swing where families could gather. Even a small church he had designed in a late-night studio session when his professor had challenged the class to create a space for the human spirit. His throat tightened. Looking at those drawings felt like reopening a wound he had taught himself to ignore, the college years. At 19, Joe had been a different person. He could still remember his first day at the School of Architecture in New Jersey. His hands had been trembling as he unrolled his drafting paper, the smell of graphite sharp in the air. He had sat in a room filled with young people, all eager, all talented. But Joe had felt something different. To him, architecture wasn't just a career. It was a calling. His professors noticed quickly. They praised the precision of his measurements, the clean boldness of his strokes. He wasn't flashy, but he was thoughtful. He believed buildings should serve people, not just impress them. Late nights became early mornings. He and his classmates huddled in the drafting studio, fueled by cheap coffee and adrenaline, their hands smudged with pencil lead. They argued about aesthetics, debated function over form, sketched and resketched until their eyes blurred. And Joe loved every second of it. Sometimes, when he walked home across campus at dawn, he would picture himself 10 years later, an architect signing off on blueprints, his name etched onto projects that shaped lives. He wanted to build schools where children could dream, homes where families could grow, hospitals that offered comfort along with care. It wasn't just ambition. It was purpose. The collapse of a family. But dreams have a way of colliding with reality. Joe's father had always been a strong man, broad-shouldered, quiet, the kind of father who didn't say much but whose presence alone steadied the family. He worked long hours at a factory, saving every spare dollar to help Joe stay in school. Then one evening the phone rang. Joe answered, and the world shifted. His father had collapsed at work. A heart attack. By the time Joe reached the hospital, it was too late. The grief was sharp, but the aftermath was worse. His mother, already fragile from years of poor health, seemed to shrink overnight. The bills piled high on the kitchen counter. Rent, utilities, medical expenses. Each envelope felt like a weight pressing down on Joe's chest. And then there were his siblings, Emily, just 14, with braces on her teeth and tears in her eyes. Michael, only 10, clinging to Joe like a lifeline. They needed him. The tuition invoice on his dorm desk stared at him like a cruel joke. Architecture wasn't cheap. And while scholarships helped, they weren't enough. Without his father's income, the family was drowning. Joe lasted another semester, juggling classes by day and shifts at a diner by night. He sent every spare dollar home. But he was burning out. His grades slipped. His professors noticed the exhaustion, and the debt collectors kept calling. One cold January morning, he made the decision. He walked into the administration office, signed the withdrawal papers, and left campus with nothing but his sketchbook under his arm. He told himself it was temporary, that he would come back someday. But someday never came. The laborer's life. The next decade blurred into hard hats, steel-toed boots, and endless hours on construction sites. He became the reliable guy, the one who showed up on time, worked without complaint, and kept his head down. No one on the sites cared about his past. To them, he was just Joe, the quiet laborer with strong arms and a bent back. If anyone noticed the way his eyes lingered on blueprints or how he sometimes sketched lines in the dirt during lunch breaks, they didn't comment, and Joe didn't explain. He buried his old life beneath cement dust and routine. He convinced himself it was enough. But the truth was, every time he saw a building rise from the ground, he felt both pride and pain. Pride, because he was part of it. Pain, because he knew he could have shaped it, not just built it. The return of the ghost. Now, years later, staring at the drawings in his sketchbook, Joe felt the past pressing down on him again. He traced the lines of a half-finished design, a community center he had once imagined. The paper was yellowed, but the idea was still alive. He could almost hear his professor's voice. Good design lasts. Even if the world forgets, the idea waits for you to return. Joe exhaled shakily. That's what today on the site had felt like. The ghost of his old life, knocking on the door he had closed. He pressed the sketchbook shut, his rough hands trembling. For years he had believed the dream was gone, buried under duty and survival. But maybe, just maybe, it had only been waiting. The morning sun was already high when Joe returned to the site the next day. The Texas heat pressed down like a heavy hand, and dust swirled lazily in the air with every footstep. From a distance, the place looked unchanged. Workers in hard hats shouted to one another, forklifts beeped as they reversed, the metallic clang of steel echoed across the skeleton of the building. But Joe could feel the difference immediately. The eyes that turned toward him weren't the same as yesterday. There was no laughter, no loud jokes at his expense. Instead, there were glances, quick, uncertain, measuring him in ways they never had before. It unsettled him. He wasn't used to being noticed. For years, he had survived by being invisible. The man who mixed cement, hauled bricks, followed orders. But invisibility was gone now, wiped away by a single piece of chalk. Carl, the site manager, was the first to break the silence. "Well, well, look who decided to grace us again," he said loudly, striding across the gravel with his clipboard tucked under his arm. His voice carried the forced bravado of a man trying to reclaim lost authority. "Did you bring your crayons today, Joe? Maybe you can teach the rest of us how to draw stick houses." A few men chuckled uneasily, but the sound lacked conviction. The memory of Richard's words, "This man is correct," still hung in the air like a stubborn echo. Joe said nothing. He bent to lift a bucket of mortar, muscles straining against the weight. Silence had always been his shield. But today, silence didn't work. Richard Hall appeared from behind a half-framed wall, his presence commanding attention without a word. He moved with calm assurance, his rolled-up sleeves revealing forearms streaked with chalk dust. He looked at Carl first. "Enough," Richard said simply. Carl stiffened. I know what you were doing," Richard cut him off. His tone was not angry, but it carried finality. Carl's mouth closed with an audible click. Then Richard turned to Joe. "Walk with me." Joe hesitated, setting the bucket down. A dozen pairs of eyes followed him as he trailed after Richard across the site. The walk felt endless, each step amplifying the thud of his boots against the concrete. Finally, they stopped beneath a shaded scaffolding, away from curious ears. Richard folded his arms. His sharp gray eyes studied Joe the way an engineer might study a bridge, looking for hidden strength or hidden cracks. "You saw something yesterday that 3 licensed architects missed," Richard began. "That doesn't happen by accident. Tell me more about your training." Joe shifted uneasily. "There's not much to tell. I studied for 2 years, then life happened." Richard's brow furrowed. "Life? My father died. My family needed money. I dropped out." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of years of buried grief. Richard was silent for a moment, then nodded slowly. "And you never went back?" Joe let out a short laugh, dry, bitter. "Going back doesn't pay rent, doesn't put food on the table. A man can't chase dreams when his siblings are hungry." Richard considered this, his face unreadable. Then, almost softly, he asked, "But the dream never left you, did it?" Joe looked away, his gaze drifting toward the rising structure. Steel beams jutted upward like the ribs of some unfinished beast, waiting for flesh. His chest tightened. "No," he admitted, "it never left." Resentment on the site. Word traveled fast. By lunchtime, everyone on the crew knew the story. Joe had spotted a flaw that could have cost the project weeks, maybe even lives. Some workers eyed him with a newfound respect. Others, like Danny, kept their distance, embarrassed by yesterday's mockery. But Carl's resentment burned hotter with each passing hour. During the break, Carl cornered Joe near the supply shed. His voice was low, venomous. "You think you're special now? One lucky guess and suddenly you're an architect again? Joe clenched his jaw but said nothing. Carl stepped closer, his breath reeking of coffee and cigarettes. Let me tell you something. Men like you don't get second chances. You're a bricklayer. That's it. Don't start thinking otherwise. Before Joe could respond, Richard's voice called from across the yard. Joe, I need you here. Carl's glare lingered like a threat before he stalked away. Joe walked toward Richard, unsettled. For years, he had accepted Carl's words as truth, but for the first time, he wasn't so sure. The seeds of change. That afternoon, Richard asked Joe to assist with measurements on the framing. It was unusual. Field assistants usually did that, not laborers. Joe hesitated but obeyed. As they worked side by side, Richard asked questions. When you drew yesterday's correction, did you calculate or was it instinct? Both, Joe answered honestly. The math was there, but after a while you just see it. Angles, weight, balance. It's like the building tells you where it wants to stand. Richard gave a small smile. Spoken like an architect. Joe's pulse quickened, but he forced himself to stay calm. He wasn't an architect. Not anymore. Still, as the hours passed, he realized something had shifted. He wasn't just laying bricks today. He was thinking, analyzing, contributing. For the first time in years, his mind felt alive again. Doubt and hope. That night, Joe returned home exhausted but restless. He opened his sketchbook again, running his hand over the old designs. He thought of Carl's words. Men like you don't get second chances. Then he thought of Richard's voice, spoken like an architect. Two visions of himself wrestled in his mind. The laborer who had accepted his fate, and the dreamer who once believed he could shape skylines. He didn't know which one would win. The site was quieter that morning, though the usual chorus of hammering and drilling filled the background. The air still smelled of sawdust and sweat, but for Joe, something intangible had changed. He felt it in the glances from the crew, some curious, some resentful, a few even respectful. It was as if overnight he had crossed an invisible line, though he wasn't sure which side he now stood on. Richard Hall found him before the morning shift had fully settled in. "Joe," he called, his deep voice carrying across the lot. "Walk with me." The words were firm, not a request. Joe set down his trowel and followed. Workers paused to watch them go, whispers rippling behind their backs. They moved toward the far edge of the property, where the skeletal frame of the building cast long shadows on the dirt. Away from curious ears, Richard stopped, crossed his arms, and studied Joe in silence for a long moment. "You saved us yesterday," Richard said finally. "Not just time, not just money. You prevented what could have been a structural failure. That's not something I take lightly." Joe shifted uncomfortably. "I just saw what others didn't. That's all." Richard's eyes sharpened. "Don't sell yourself short. Most men would have kept their mouths shut. You didn't. You acted." Joe looked down at his boots, scuffed and caked with mud. Compliments made him uneasy. He'd spent too many years swallowing insults to know what to do with praise. Richard stepped closer. "My firm is growing. We're understaffed in technical assistants, people who can read a blueprint, spot errors, and bridge the gap between the office and the field. Most assistants know theory but have no idea what it feels like to pour cement under a 100-degree sun. You, Joe, have both." Joe blinked, uncertain he'd heard right. "You're offering me a job?" "A start," Richard replied, his voice calm but deliberate. "A chance to step out of the shadows. You'd still be learning, but under my supervision. You'd earn more, and eventually, if you wanted, you could sit for exams. It wouldn't be easy, but it's possible." The weight of doubt. The words hung in the air like a promise too good to believe. For years, Joe had taught himself not to dream. Dreams only made reality harder to swallow. He had convinced himself that architecture was a closed chapter, a book he had no right to reopen. And yet here was Richard Hall, an architect with decades of experience, holding the door ajar. Joe's heart thundered. "Why me?" he asked quietly. "Because I know talent when I see it," Richard said, "and because you remind me of myself years ago. Except you had the courage to work with your hands when life demanded it. That takes grit, and grit is worth more than any diploma." Joe swallowed hard. Part of him wanted to believe, to step through the doorway Richard was opening. But another part clung to fear, the voice of Carl, of every foreman who had dismissed him as nothing more than muscle. "What if I'm not good enough anymore?" Joe whispered. Richard's gaze softened, though his voice stayed steady. "You already proved yesterday that you are." Carl's fury. When Joe returned to the crew, Carl's glare found him almost instantly. The site manager had seen them talking. His face was red, his jaw clenched. "Enjoy your little field trip?" Carl sneered, loud enough for others to hear. "Careful, Joe. Don't start thinking you're better than the rest of us." Joe tried to brush past him, but Carl stepped in his way. "Let me tell you something," he hissed, low and sharp. "I've been running sites like this for 20 years. Men who try to climb above their station get chewed up and spit out. Don't embarrass yourself." Before Joe could answer, Richard's voice called from across the site. "Joe, I need you on measurements again." Carl's face darkened, but he stepped aside. His threat lingered in the air, but it couldn't erase the fact that things were shifting. The crew knew it. Carl knew it. And Joe, whether he admitted it or not, knew it too. Testing the waters. Over the next few days, Richard quietly pulled Joe into more technical tasks. He had him check framing angles, compare load-bearing calculations, even review supply orders. Joe's hands still carried mortar and brick, but his mind was sharpening again, awakening muscles he hadn't flexed in years. At first he doubted himself. He second-guessed every number, hesitated before giving input. But Richard pushed him gently. "Trust what you see," he would say. "Your instincts are better than you think." The crew noticed. Some admired the change. Others, like Danny, remained wary. Carl simmered, his authority threatened by the quiet recognition Joe was gaining. For Joe, it was a strange limbo, half laborer, half assistant, belonging fully to neither world. He went home each night with sore arms and an even sorer mind, torn between exhaustion and exhilaration. Confrontation with the past. One evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the site in shades of gold, Richard walked with Joe to the edge of the lot. "You remind me of myself at your age," Richard said suddenly. "Did you know I almost quit architecture once?" Joe looked at him, startled. "You?" Richard nodded. "My father was a carpenter. He thought architecture was a waste of time, told me I'd never make a living staring at paper. I nearly believed him. But someone gave me a chance, a professor who saw what I didn't. Without that, I'd still be swinging a hammer, bitter about what I lost." Joe felt the words strike deep. They were too close to his own story, too raw. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked. "Because everyone needs someone to believe in them," Richard replied. "I think it's your turn." The internal battle. That night, Joe sat again with his sketchbook. The pages stared back at him like mirrors of the man he used to be. He traced the lines of an old design, a modest community center with wide windows and open spaces. He imagined it built, filled with children laughing, families gathering. Then he imagined it lying unfinished in his drawer, gathering dust forever. Carl's words echoed in his mind. "Men like you don't get second chances." But Richard's voice answered, "You already proved you're good enough." The tug of war inside him was fierce. He feared failing, feared proving Carl right, but deeper still, he feared what would happen if he never tried. The moment of decision. The following morning, Richard approached him again. "I need an answer," he said plainly. "I want you on my team. As an assistant. Not tomorrow, not in some distant future, now. You'll learn, you'll make mistakes, but you'll grow. And you'll stop hiding from what you were meant to do." Joe felt the eyes of the crew on him, though they pretended to work. The weight of choice pressed on his chest like a stone. He looked at Richard, then at his own hands, scarred, rough, built by years of labor. Could those same hands hold pencils again? Draft buildings again? The answer trembled on his lips. The site was buzzing with its usual chaos, but for Joe, the world had narrowed to one moment. Richard Hall's words still lingered in the air. "I need an answer. Now." Joe felt every pair of eyes on him, though the crew pretended to keep working. Hammers rose and fell, nails pierced wood, but the rhythm faltered. They were listening, waiting. He looked at Richard, the man who had not only spotted his talent, but had spoken of it aloud, unafraid of the consequences. Then he looked at Carl, standing a short distance away, arms crossed, a satisfied smirk on his face as if certain Joe would back down. And finally, he looked at his own hands. Calloused, scarred, hardened by years of labor. Hands that had built walls but once drew dreams. The silence stretched. Joe's chest tightened with doubt, but somewhere inside him, another voice rose, a voice he had buried years ago. "What if you can still do this?" He inhaled, slow and steady. Then he met Richard's gaze and said the words he hadn't dared believe in for a decade. "I'll do it." The shockwave. It wasn't loud, but it hit the site like an explosion. Danny dropped his hammer with a clang. One of the older workers whistled under his breath. Even the forklift driver stopped mid-turn, his engine growling in the silence. Richard nodded, calm as ever, but there was something in his eyes, a spark of approval, of recognition. "Good. Then let's get started." Carl's face turned red, then pale. "This is insane," he snapped. "He's a laborer. He doesn't belong in an office. He'll drag the whole project down." Richard's tone cut through his rant like steel. "That's enough, Carl. My decision is final." The site manager sputtered but said no more. The balance of power had shifted, and everyone knew it. The first steps. Richard wasted no time. That very day, he handed Joe a set of updated blueprints and asked him to review the framing corrections. Joe's pulse quickened as he traced the lines, familiar yet distant, like meeting an old friend after years apart. At first, his movements were hesitant. His pencil wobbled slightly as he measured angles, recalculated loads, but muscle memory soon returned. The numbers clicked, the shapes made sense, and before long his hand steadied. Richard watched quietly, offering guidance when needed but never hovering. "Trust yourself," he reminded. By lunch, Joe had marked 3 minor adjustments that would improve efficiency. Richard nodded in satisfaction. Exactly what I was hoping for. The crew's reaction was mixed. Some muttered resentment, teacher's pet, wannabe architect, but others, especially the younger men, began to look at Joe differently, respectfully, curiously. Danny, who had mocked him just days earlier, finally approached. "Hey, thanks for catching that mistake the other day. I guess I was wrong about you." Joe gave a small, tired smile. "I was wrong about me, too." Carl's last stand. But Carl wasn't finished. That afternoon, he cornered Joe behind the supply shed just as he had before. His eyes burned with fury. "You think this is going to last? Hall might like you now, but when you screw up, and you will, he'll toss you aside, and you'll come crawling back here worse off than before." Joe met his glare calmly. For years, Carl's words would have cut deep, but not anymore. Not after Richard's faith. Not after hearing his own voice say, "I'll do it." "Maybe I'll screw up," Joe said evenly, "but at least I'll know I tried. That's more than you can say." Carl's face twisted, but before he could respond, Richard's voice called Joe back. The moment broke, and Carl was left fuming in silence. Rediscovering the dream days turned into weeks. Joe split his time between labor and technical work, his hands rough with mortar by morning and ink-stained by afternoon. It was exhausting, but for the first time in years, he didn't dread the fatigue. Every night, he went home with sore muscles and a mind alive with numbers, shapes, possibilities. The sketchbook became his constant companion again. He filled its yellowed pages with new designs, homes with wide porches, schools filled with light, even a renovation plan for the very site he worked on. He felt like a man awakening from a long sleep. The bitterness that had once weighed on him began to fade, replaced by something fragile but growing: hope. The cruise shift. The crew adapted slowly. Some never warmed to the idea of bricklayer turned assistant, but others began to respect him. They sought his advice on measurements, even asked him to explain blueprints they didn't understand. Danny, in particular, followed him around like a shadow. "Show me how you knew the wall was off," he'd ask. Or, "Teach me that trick with the chalk." Joe didn't mind. In fact, he found himself enjoying it. He realized he wasn't just reclaiming his dream. He was helping others see construction differently, too. Even Carl's power waned. The more Richard leaned on Joe, the less influence Carl held. He barked orders as always, but fewer men listened with fear. A visit to the past. One evening, after another long day, Joe took a detour on his way home. He found himself outside a small community college. He hadn't walked through campus gates in years, but the sight stirred something deep inside him. Students streamed out, laughing, carrying tubes of drawings and models. Joe stood at a distance, invisible, but for a moment he saw himself among them, the young man who once believed he could change the world with a pencil and paper. His eyes stung. He wasn't 19 anymore. He couldn't undo the past. But maybe he could still build something lasting. The conversation that changed everything. A week later, Richard sat down with Joe in the makeshift site office. Papers, blueprints, and coffee cups littered the desk. Richard leaned back in his chair, studying him. "You've done good work," he said. "Better than I expected." Joe shifted in his seat. "I'm just trying not to let you down." Richard's lips twitched into a small smile. "You haven't. But let me ask you something. What do you want out of this?" Joe hesitated. No one had asked him that in years. What did he want? Security for his family, of course. But deeper than that, "I want to finish what I started," Joe said finally. "I want to design again. Not just fix mistakes, not just follow orders. I want to create." Richard nodded, as if he had been waiting for that answer all along. "Then that's what we'll work toward, step by step. You won't get there overnight, but with time, you will." Joe's throat tightened. For the first time in a decade, he believed it. The final realization. Weeks later, Joe stood on the scaffold at sunset, looking over the rising building. The steel beams were now clothed in walls, the skeleton taking shape into something real, something permanent. He closed his eyes, imagining the families who would one day live here, children running through halls, parents cooking in kitchens. And he felt it. The same fire that had once driven him in college, now burning brighter because it had been tested, nearly extinguished and somehow survived. He whispered softly to himself, as if speaking to the ghosts of his past. "I'm still here, and I'm not done yet." Epilogue. That night, Joe returned home and opened his sketchbook once more. He added a new page. The building he was helping construct, sketched in full, bold lines. Beneath it, he wrote a single note: not just built, designed. And for the first time in years, Joe allowed himself to dream without fear. The forgotten architect had returned, not in title yet, but in spirit. The laborer who once hid in silence had spoken, drawn, chosen, and though the road ahead would be hard, one truth was clear. Joe's story wasn't over. It was only beginning.